Good afternoon. My name is Richard Albert. I'm chair of the Younger Comparatists Committee here in the Society. And this is the panel that we have put together for your enjoyment, so we hope you enjoy. We've enjoyed the process of putting it together. Let me introduce the panel with 3 thank yous. The first thank you goes to Ralph Michaels, the Program Committee Chair, for giving us a really prime scheduling slot. We usually get the very last slot, by which time people have left, but now we're in the heart of the conference, so you're stuck with us. Second thank you to Wolf Call, who is my colleague on the YCC. The YCC issued a call for papers to fill today's panel, and Wolf Call chairs a scholarship advisory group which was tasked with the responsibility of reviewing the many submissions we received in response to our call, and his group did a really, really good job in going through the papers. So Wolf, thank you for your work in leading that group. And the third thank you is to our senior scholars here on the panel. Francesca Bignami and Miguel Shore to my left will serve as senior discussants on the 2 papers that were selected in the call for papers, and those papers were authored by Nicholas Stephanopoulos, an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, to my far right, and Ozan Varol, assistant professor at Lewis and Clark Law School. The papers were made available to you on the website, and if you don't have them, I'm sure Nicholas and Ozan will be happy to email you a copy after today's presentation. We will proceed as follows. Nicholas will give a presentation on his paper, followed by Ozan, and then Francesca and Miguel will give their comments on both papers, after which I'll be happy to take a cue and invite your questions and comments for any of the 4 panelists. Again, this is a real pleasure of ours on the YCC to be able to host this panel, and thank you for your interest.
All right, thank you, Richard, and thank you also to Miguel and Francesca for reading the papers and agreeing to serve as commentators. So my paper is a piece on comparative election law, and in particular on how different countries around the world handle the very difficult issue of redistricting. And as you probably know, there's a very large literature on electoral systems as a whole. This is the long-running debate between proportional representation and single-member districting. And there are also very large country-specific literatures on how the US or Britain or Canada, et cetera, deal with redistricting. But there's been almost nothing written about comparative redistricting in particular. And so that's the gap that this paper tries to fill. And the paper divides the task of district design into 3 main elements. First, redistricting institutions. So what are the different institutional actors that are involved in the line drawing process? Second, redistricting criteria. So what are the actual requirements that are used to shape districts? And third, minority representation. So what steps, if any, are taken to provide representation to minority groups? And the paper also has 3 main goals. The first is descriptive, just to provide in a single place concise summaries of how different countries tackle redistricting. The second goal is more taxonomic, so to introduce frameworks for classifying the different models that are used around the world. And the third goal is more purely normative, so to actually offer some arguments about which models seem to be preferable, all things considered. And the paper's overarching thesis is that along all 3 of these elements of district design, the United States is a pretty extreme outlier, and that the US would be better off following the lead of the rest of the world and moving away from its current electoral exceptionalism. So I'll start with redistricting institutions. And both for this area and for the next 2, I'll pretty much skip all the descriptive stuff and go right to the conceptual and normative arguments. So the paper presents 2 dimensions along which we can classify different redistricting institutions. First, politicization. So how involved are political actors as opposed to independent commissions in the task of district design. And the second dimension is judicialization. So how involved are the courts in this process? And we can combine both of these dimensions into one pretty 2x2 matrix. And as you can see, the United States is quite an outlier. It's the only country at present in the high politicization, high judicialization quadrant of the matrix. That means that political actors are drawing the district lines with extensive judicial oversight. The handful of US states that currently have commissions are in the low politicization but still high judicialization quadrant. There's a handful of sort of borderline democracies that are in the high politicization, low judicialization quadrant. So they have political actors drawing the lines with minimal judicial oversight. And then almost every democracy on earth that needs to redistrict is currently in the low politicization, low judicialization quadrant. So those countries have independent redistricting commissions, usually staffed with bureaucrats or academics or judges. And those commissions, the plans they come up with, usually, although not always, are enacted into law without the need for legislative approval. And the courts in those nations are typically very deferential. If they're involved at all, they almost never strike down the product of these redistricting commissions. So let me turn next to my normative argument about institutions. This is a little history that we're going to skip. So the normative point is just that the low politicization, low judicialization quadrant offers a number of advantages over the American position of high politicization and high judicialization. The first advantage is that as long as they're properly constructed, which they typically are, independent commissions are not going to deliberately gerrymander in favor of one party or another. You know, they're not going to intentionally try to distort district lines for the sake of partisan advantage. More important than the intent point is the results point. So the actual empirical results of commission-crafted plans are superior to those of politician-crafted plans. And what I mean by these results are that the commission-crafted plans typically are more symmetric in their treatment of the major parties. That means their levels of partisan bias are lower. Commission-crafted plans are typically more responsive to changes in public opinion in the electorate. And commission-crafted plans also usually have more competitive races than politician-drawn plans. And then a final advantage of the usual foreign approach is just that you don't need courts if you can trust the institutions you have drawing the district lines. There's been lots of criticism in the US of the sort of extravagantly intrusive role that the judiciary has played in redistricting, and you don't need the courts to do that if you can actually trust commissions to come up with fair district plans. There are counter-arguments to these points, but I'm going to skip them now, and if you'd like to address them later in the Q&A, I'd be happy to. So the second element of district design is redistricting criteria, so the actual requirements that apply to the drawing of districts. And the US has an extremely strict equal population requirement. Let me go down actually to here. And the US also has the Voting Rights Act, which in many cases requires majority-minority districts to be drawn in areas where minority populations are concentrated. And it's not a legal rule, but there's a systematic practice in the US of almost always drawing district lines with political advantage as the primary goal. Other countries have much more relaxed equal population rules, and they also have rules in place like respect for political subdivisions, respect for communities of interest, attention to geographic features, attention to means of communication and means of travel, so a whole panoply of other criteria. So the paper proposes to classify all these rules based on whether they tend to make districts more homogeneous or heterogeneous. So most of the American criteria are diversifying. because they tend to produce districts whose residents are relatively divergent from one another, both ideologically and demographically. So for example, to comply with the US's very strict one person, one vote rule, you often have to put very different sorts of people within the same district to hit that very precise population target. Similarly, to maximize political advantage, to gerrymander as effectively as possible, the ideal strategy is to combine slightly more of one party's diehard supporters with slightly fewer of the other party's most loyal supporters. And so those sorts of districts are also inherently extremely heterogeneous. On the other hand, most of the foreign criteria are homogenizing because they tend to produce districts whose residents are relatively similar to one another. So there's lots of evidence, for example, that political subdivisions like towns and counties are very homogeneous. And so not surprisingly, if you draw districts to correspond to political subdivisions, those districts are going to be homogeneous as well. Similarly, communities of interest are often defined as groups of people with shared social or economic interests. And so again, if you're drawing districts to be congruent with these communities, of course the districts are going to be homogeneous. Okay, so is there any way to choose between the diversifying criteria of the US and the more homogenizing criteria that the rest of the world uses? I don't think this is as easy a choice as the one between commissions and politicians for having the authority to draw district lines. But I do think there are several reasons why the rest of the world's homogenizing criteria are preferable. First, the homogenizing criteria make gerrymandering more difficult because they take off the table those ideal 51-49 districts that would-be gerrymanders would like to draw. Second, there's some good political science evidence that there's higher participation in more homogeneous districts. People are better informed and more likely to turn out to vote. Third, it's easier for politicians to represent more homogeneous districts. And this is because the needs and the interests of the residents of those districts are much more clearly discernible by the representatives. Fourth, there's also lower polarization in more homogeneous districts. So precisely because politicians are more responsive to their constituents, they're less responsive to the desires of their political party. And then finally, homogenizing criteria are just a better conceptual fit with territorial districting, which is the basic assumption of the American redistricting system. All of these homogenizing criteria, their unifying theme is that they pay a lot of attention to the underlying political geography of the jurisdiction. So that fits naturally with our emphasis on geography in districting. And once again, I'll skip all the counter arguments so I can get to the final element of district design. So that final element is minority representation. So how to provide representation to various racial or ethnic or religious minority groups. And here the paper proposes to classify these policies along two dimensions. The first is whether the policies benefit only concentrated minority groups or also diffuse minority groups. And the second dimension is whether the policies allocate seats in the legislature explicitly or more implicitly to these various groups. And once again, we can combine these two dimensions into a snazzy 2x2 matrix. So as I mentioned before, the US has a rule that under the Voting Rights Act, majority minority districts need to be drawn in areas where there are concentrated minority populations. So we can place this policy in the concentrated implicit quadrant. It only benefits dense minority populations, but the districts that it results in are not formally reserved for minorities. Any candidate is free to run and try to win in those districts. The US has another rule, also under the Voting Rights Act, that certain jurisdictions in the South are not allowed to reduce their levels of minority representation. They're not allowed to retrogress, is the term of art. So that rule also benefits only concentrated minority populations, but it's quite a bit more overt in the protection that it gives to minority groups. And so it straddles the line between the implicit and explicit portions of the matrix. In the rest of the world, there is a pretty wide variety of approaches taken to minority representation. A few examples: India reserves certain districts for certain tribes and castes in areas where those groups are concentrated. So we can place that policy in the concentrated explicit quadrant. New Zealand has an entirely separate district map for the Maori population in which only those voters who register as Maori are allowed to vote. We can place that policy in the diffuse explicit quadrant. Singapore has a party slating requirement that says that if a party wants to contest a multi-member district, it needs to include at least one minority member on its slate for that district. So we can also place that policy in the diffuse explicit quadrant. And finally, and most relevant to my paper, a lot of countries use small multi-member districts with either limited or cumulative or preferential voting systems. So some voting rule other than winner take all. And we can fit those policies into the diffuse implicit quadrant because dispersed minority groups can win seats in those districts, and those rules are completely neutral, at least on their face, with respect to race and ethnicity. And so here my normative argument is that this final foreign approach, the multi-member districts with the alternative voting rules, are preferable to the usual American approach under the Voting Rights Act. Those foreign systems enable diffuse groups to win representation, and that's a good thing because whether a minority group is represented should not hinge on the accident of its spatial distribution. Second, those foreign systems don't recognize race or ethnicity explicitly. There's an awful lot of controversy in America about majority-minority districts that look funny, that are intentionally constructed to have a majority of one group. All of that controversy disappears if you have larger districts that are race-neutral and in which any large minority group can win representation. A third advantage is just higher levels of representation. So there's good evidence that these foreign systems result in nearly proportional representation for minority groups. And that's substantially higher than the representation that African Americans or Hispanics have received under the status quo in the US. And a final point is that there is endless litigation in America under the Voting Rights Act. The need for all those bitter lawsuits largely disappears if you don't have to fight over the boundaries of single-member districts and instead can draw larger districts where minority groups are much more easily able to win representation. So just to conclude, the main takeaway from my paper, I think, is that the US is exceptional with respect to all the main elements of district design, institutions and criteria and minority representation. And in each area, America's exceptionalism is quite problematic, and I think we'd be better off following the lead of the rest of the world here. So thank you very much.
Let me begin by thanking Miguel and Francesca for taking the time to read our papers and comment on them. And I'd also like to thank Richard Albert for all of his hard work as chair of the YCC and making sure that us younger comparativists are connected to each other, and also in making sure that we have a voice in conferences such as this. So the project that I'm going to talk about today actually builds on an article that I presented on this very panel last year. That was titled The Democratic Coup d'etat, and that was published in the Harvard International Law Journal this past summer. That article examined the role that the military can play in deposing a dictatorship and establishing democratic procedures where political leaders are selected through free and fair elections. This project picks up to some extent from where the article left off and asks whether the military can provide institutional support to an emerging democracy after democratic procedures have been established, but the democracy still remains new and weak. Under the long-entrenched orthodoxy in constitutional theory, a constitutional or political role for the military in an emerging democracy necessarily hinders democratic progress. This paper challenges that conventional thinking and argues that the ideal level of military involvement in a new democracy is not always zero. Counterintuitively, certain militaries can play and actually have played a democracy-promoting role in emerging democracies. When it's arguable that the existing theory, which actually mandates separation between the civilian realm and the military realm, accurately describes the state of affairs in the United States, the civil-military relations in the U.S. have shown degrees of intermingling over the past 2 centuries. I think we're doing a disservice by advocating the wholesale export of that theory to very different contexts, to the context of fledgling democracies. So in this talk, I'll address 2 questions. One, why the military might be actually able and willing to provide institutional support to a new democracy. And 2, what types of militaries are more capable of doing so. And in the context of that discussion, I'll also give some examples from the comparative case studies I use in the article. Now, let me be clear from the outset that there are certainly costs associated with enlisting help from the military, the primary one being that once you get the military into politics, how do you get them out? And in certain contexts, those costs will certainly outweigh the benefits. My aim in this paper is to explain the benefits, which no one has done before, and also analyze and begin to analyze the way that we can minimize the costs. Now, in post-authoritarian societies, there's a serious democratic enforcement deficit that threatens to derail and often does derail the democratic transition process. Adam Przeworski has argued that the establishment of democracy is the least likely outcome of an attempted democratic transition. So the world, if you look around the world, is littered with failed democratic transitions. Why? Well, new democracies tend to lack an ethos of political pluralism, stable legal and political institutions necessary to support a competitive democracy, and effective enforcement mechanisms designed to make sure that these newly elected political actors don't misbehave. To many newly elected political actors in these democracies, individual rights and liberties are mere parchment barriers, as James Madison famously argued. And in the absence of institutions designed to preserve and promote democracy and stability over a painfully lengthy and turbulent transition period, the danger that powerful groups will use the newly established democratic processes to undermine democracy itself is all too great. And at least in some contexts, the constitutional savior of these failed democracies, the glue that can hold these turbulent transitions together, might be located somewhere where we haven't been looking before, outside the familiar institutions in Montesquieu's tripartite scheme of government. Now, any person or institution placed in this position of power in a new democracy is likely to be self-interested, and that, of course, includes the military. The article accepts the military as a self-interested actor, but argues that the institutional self-interest of the military may align with the 3 primary conditions that Madison and others have described as conducive to the genesis of a constitutional democracy: political pluralism, intrastate stability, and national unity. And I'll focus on the first 2 in this talk. The promotion of these conditions isn't some altruistic grand formal plan by foresightful military leaders. Rather, the military's furtherance of its own institutional self-interest may have the largely unintended byproduct of promoting democratic progress. Now, turning first to political pluralism, the establishment of competitive political parties and in a marketplace in which those parties can operate are the primary factors in determining a state's probability of becoming and remaining a democracy, and that's a proposition that's been empirically established. In a post-authoritarian society, though, political parties are likely to be weak or non-existent because an authoritarian regime ensures its own survival by silencing and stifling political opposition. But the military, which is necessary to the survival of most nations, is often left untouched. And as odd as it sounds, in some cases the military may have an institutional interest in maintaining political opposition and preventing the domination of the government by a single powerful group. Why? Well, if a political party becomes too strong, that party can threaten the military's interests curb the military's powers, and strip the military of its economic and social privileges. In contrast, the military may find more autonomy and comfort in the division of political powers that political pluralism produces. I talked about how this works in the article in Turkey and Portugal, but most recently this theoretical scenario obtained some practical validation in Egypt as well. In the immediate aftermath of the coup that toppled the Mubarak regime in February 2011, the military's interests were aligned to a large extent with those of the Muslim Brotherhood. From the military's perspective, the Brotherhood promised stability after a tumultuous revolution and a turbulent transition period. But as the democratic transition progressed and the Brotherhood grew to be ambitious and opportunistic, capturing both the presidency and the parliament, the military's interests also shifted. Instead of supporting the Brotherhood's electoral prospects, the military began to oppose them. The military, for example, tried to impose supra-constitutional principles to rein in the Constituent Assembly, which were not successful, and then came the rulings of the Judicial, which Clark Lombardi discussed in his talk, and the military welcomed them with alacrity and enforced them, dissolving the Constituent Assembly and the Parliament. The Constituent Assembly, the new one at least, is far more representative than the initial assembly that was in power and dissolved as unrepresentative by the judiciary. And the military-led democratic transition processes in Turkey and Portugal produced genuine multi-party democracies. Turkey went through this in the 1960s, and Portugal went through it in the 1970s. The 1961 Turkish constitution is widely viewed as the most liberal constitution in Turkish history, even though it was drafted under military supervision. It protects numerous individual liberties in line with the then unfolding rights of the revolution. It creates checks and balances, and it promotes political pluralism through the adoption of proportional representation. Under the Turkish military supervision, the two-party system that existed in Turkey in the 1950s became a genuine multi-party system in the 1960s, and 6 major parties participated in the elections that were supervised by the militaries. But like all good things, too much political pluralism can be bad, and Robert Dahl has lamented that the perennial problem of political pluralism is that there is either too much or too little. I talked about the problems of too little political pluralism, but excessive political pluralism also has its own issues. It can create a large number of weak parties, which in turn can cause factionalism, legislative deadlocks, instability, and lead to democratic breakdown. And military interventions tend to occur when political institutions are weak or unstable. So the creation of the right amount of opposition is a formidable challenge for any democracy, and I argue in the article that Portugal struck that balance well following its military-led transition to democracy, which empowered political parties, which in turn kicked the military out of power from a position of strength. But Turkey did not strike that balance well in the 1960s. The Turks took Madison's message of promoting multiplicity of interest too far. In adopting proportional representation and also numerous checks and balances on the elected branches, the Constitution significantly weakened the elected branches and strengthened the bureaucracy. And that arrangement produced decades of weak coalition governments between political parties that despised each other, which in turn led to legislative impasses and created power vacuums, prompting the military to stage further interventions. So that's pluralism. Turning now to stability, interstate stability tends to promote the advancement of a new democracy. The existence of a stable framework for decision-making avoids conflict, costly conflict over the rules of the game, and enables the government to do what it's designed to do, which is to govern through collective decision-making. If the regime is unstable, the institutions necessary for democratic constitutionalism may never form or take longer to form. So, for example, sectarian strife between Shiites and Sunnis in Iraq continues to present significant challenges to the establishment of a liberal democracy there. So does the tribal infighting in Libya. In addition to promoting democratic development, interstate stability also advances, in many cases, the military's interests as an institution. The military and the state are in a symbiotic relationship. Neither can survive without the other. And militaries tend to be risk-adverse institutions that conflate their own future with that of a functioning state apparatus. The absence of stability leads to chaos, civil war, and most importantly from the military's perspective, vulnerability to foreign conquest, creating enormous costs. So the military may advance its own interests by actively serving as a stabilizer of the new democracy, which it did in the case of Portugal, which produces as a byproduct, again, a space for democratic institutions to form and progress. That brings me to the second question, which is what types of militaries are capable of serving this function of promoting political pluralism and stability in new democracies? Now, when constitutional and political scientist theorists speak of the military, many do so in a homogeneous fashion. They assume that militaries across the world are all hegemonic and praetorian institutions, consistent in their composition, structure, and motives across very different nations. But not all militaries are the same. Just like presidents and legislatures differ from one another, so the militaries. The primary objection against a political or constitutional role for the military is that the military, unlike other political actors, is unaccountable. You can vote presidents and legislators out of office, but the military, well, they have guns, and they're answerable to no one. In this article, I argue that certain militaries, what I call the interdependent militaries, are more accountable and responsive to civil society and democratic norms than praetorian militaries traditionally associated with the establishment of dictatorship. There are a number of desiderata that describe the interdependent military, but I'll focus on two here. First, the interdependent military is made up of citizen soldiers, at least at its lower ranks, and not professionals. So citizen soldiers are recruited primarily through mandatory national conscription to serve a defined term in the military before going back to the civilian sector. And the recruitment of citizen soldiers ensures that the military represents a fair cross-section of the population. And actually, a military composed of citizen soldiers may be more representative than the society than other branches of government. Civilians rotate from the civilian sector to the military and back to the civilian sector, creating this feedback loop which keeps the military in touch with civilian values. For that reason, the interdependent militaries are less likely than their professional counterparts to stray too far off from public demands and more capable of providing institutional support to a new democracy. Citizen soldiers also inject another important element to the military, which is diversity. Militaries that are made up of citizen soldiers tend to be more diverse in terms of religion, ethnicity, culture, and social status than professional militaries. And for a dictatorship, a diverse military poses formidable challenges because dictatorships are more likely to be able to successfully use violence when there are differences in ethnicity, class, regime, social status, or culture between the users and the victims of the regime violence. And that's precisely why some authoritarian regimes have rejected the citizen soldier model. So if you look at Bahrain, where a Sunni autocracy rules a Shia majority, they disallow Shias from serving in the military. The second desiderata, which I'll briefly mention here, is that the military, the interdependent military, is dependent not only on the domestic population through its recruitment of citizen soldiers, but also on international democratic institutions. Although democratization is fundamentally an internal process, external factors can have some influence. The officers of the interdependent military often receive military training in Western nations, so they train alongside officers in Western nations that have long adopted democratic norms. For example, membership in NATO produced a progressive set of NATO officers in Turkey in the 1960s, and in Portugal in the 1970s, that was a crucial factor that assisted the democratic transition process in those nations as they looked to their European neighbors as beacons to follow. So to conclude, despite the positive qualities of the interdependent military and the democracy-promoting functions it can serve, ideally, of course, it would be enlightened civilians and not military leaders that would enable the requisite conditions to establish and sustain a constitutional democracy. But in the frequent absence of such civilian institutions, it may be necessary to enlist the help of non-traditional and second-best actors, such as the interdependent military, and temporarily preserve, during the initial stages of the transition process, when the transition is at its most fragile point, checks and balances on the elected branches to promote democratic progress. In an imperfect transition process, the second best may be the best we can do. Thank you.
Well, I very much enjoyed both their papers. They were both highly impressive, and I have some suggestions for improvement coming from sort of the comparative law discipline. for both of them, but the basic takeaway is that they were incredibly impressive. So let me start with Nick's paper on voting systems and suggest make 3 points here. One, that the comparative law analysis can be sharpened. 2, that I'm skeptical of some of the lessons that were drawn from other jurisdictions. And 3rd, which isn't particularly a comparative law point, but I thought that you could more specifically address your use of principal agent theory, because you use it a lot in the paper. You don't actually talk about it much in the presentation, but in the paper you use it a lot. So in terms of sharpening the use of comparative law here, the structure of the paper is very much taking a legal institution, or a legal set of rules, which is districting, evaluating them on a series of criteria, and then making a recommendation for the US system, which is essentially a small multi-member districts with cumulative or voting rules, or limited voting rules, that are chosen by independent commissions. So I don't know if I'm overly simplifying your analysis, but at the end of the paper, that was what I took away from it, that we should move towards maybe California's model, some of the models that are used at the state level for selecting state legislators. And I thought that it would be interesting to flip that analysis using a conventional functional method. And functional method very loosely described here. I'm using it in a very loose sense. I know that whenever anybody says functional method, ears are raised, etc. But so this is a very loose use of the functional method. But we can flip the analysis by asking, so what are the purposes that are commonly pursued in designing an electoral system? And in your analysis, when you're evaluating pros and cons, you mention many of these different purposes. And number 1 is representation, as in a fit between elected representatives and the electoral base, which you talk about in the context of reducing partisan bias and increasing electoral representation and flexibility. When the base preferences the base shift, so does the composition of the elected representatives. And a second objective in designing electoral systems that enables us to compare different systems across the world is respect for political units, because we think that political units are an important arena of political debate and representation, and so make for a real viable set of constituencies where debate can take place. A third purpose is minority representation, which you talk about. A fourth purpose in designing electoral system is stability, because we want to make sure that we don't have unstable parliaments, with unstable majorities. You don't talk about that, but that's another purpose that could be used in designing an electoral system. Now, the 3 purposes that you talk about do have trade-offs. And so by being explicit about them, you can actually be explicit about the trade-offs. So in the US system, so representation of political units actually is oftentimes has to be traded off against minority representation, because minorities are not necessarily politically concentrated. And so you have to gerrymander in order to get a minority representation, so you sacrifice the political unit. And so, so being explicit about the purposes here of electoral design not only allows you to compare across jurisdictions, but it'd be more explicit about what the possible trade-offs are, and also sort of culturally speaking, how we make these choices about trade-offs. Because in the United States, essentially, we are idiosyncratic in that minority representation really dominates our thinking about electoral law for historical reasons. And so minority representation has to be always balanced with respect for political units because of our historical circumstances. So that's on the purpose side of the comparative method and the functional method. Now, the rules and institutions that electoral systems use to accomplish these purposes, you frame it in terms of districting, but actually, there are actually a couple different components to what you're talking about. One is how we district. Number 2, what kind of districts? Are these single-member districts, multi-member districts? And number 3 is the structure of the ballot, which you don't really actually talk about very much in the presentation, but you mentioned preferential voting, which essentially is a structure of ballot which can be used both in a single-member district, a first-past-the-post system, as well as plurality system. So these are different dimensions of the electoral system, and these are different legal rules. And so rather than characterizing what you're talking about as districting, it's helpful to think about, and in fact what you do in the end is to talk about the different dimensions of all these rules that you are advocating in the American context. And so that sharpens, I think that kind of sharpens the analysis and actually shows how conventional comparative law can be used in this context of public law, electoral design, where conventional comparative law starts by thinking about the general purposes that multiple systems seek to accomplish, and then the rules taken as a whole, and rather than piecemeal in addressing these different common purposes. So that's the first point about how, not necessarily that the paper has to be written, but how it can, at least the comparative method, the functional method, can sharpen some of the normative punch of the paper. And the second point is lessons from different jurisdictions. Now you say that by moving to, and this is the point about independent commissions as opposed to legislatures in designing districts. And you say that by moving to low politicization, we're going to get low judicialization in the United States. And I have some skepticism about that, and that's actually, it relates to what in comparative law we talk about when we talk about legal formants, or actually in political science you might talk about as an admitted variable problem, or there's a lot going on in the American system that isn't simply about the design of the procedure for selecting the commission. There are all sorts of features of the American system that lead to a certain kind of litigation culture. And so these quadrants that were up on the board, essentially they characterize every dimension of the American system as compared to European systems. So not just the electoral area, but environmental law, securities law, and any variation of constitutional law. And why is that? Well, because we have all sorts of other rules that foster, and cultural norms that foster litigation in the American system that don't exist elsewhere. And so I'm not saying that it's necessarily not going to happen, that we're going to get lower judicialization, that it's necessarily not going to happen, but I'm saying that there's reason for skepticism. And the reason for skepticism would either go to a legal formants kind of theory, a la Sacco, or just to a more general theory from political science, since you seem to draw a lot from that, talking about all these other variables at stake in trying to understand what the impact of depolitization would be in the American system. And so the third point here is you use principal agent, and this is just this is actually a very minor point, but you use principal agent as a so-called explanatory theory, and I wonder whether it's actually explaining here in terms of causal explanation, because you say, well, with to explain the move from so high judicialization to low judicialization. When we move from high politicization to low politicization, we need principal agent theory, because now courts are satisfied that essentially elected representatives are representing their base, because the district hasn't been gerrymandered. You know, that we can, this is a credible design of the district that is going to capture a preference function and reduce strategic voting, because we have an independent commission that's been chosen to do this. But I wonder really if that's using principal agent theory as explanatory, and rather than using it simply as a shorthand for political theory, essentially, that courts use when they're reviewing these kinds of decisions. They think that electoral districts should be designed in order to foster real representation rather than strategic voting and et cetera. So they think they should be designed to capture certain features of the population when we go to vote, and i.e. the principle that the people should be represented by the agents. And so they're in their theories of judicial review, that's what they're relying on. But this isn't really a principal-agent theory in terms of explanation, at least in my limited realm, where I use principal-agent theory in order to explain institutional design. Where there's a clear principle that's actually doing the institutional design. In the Ministry of Law area, you have a principle, i.e. a majority in Congress, that designs agencies, administrative agencies, and in order to, the agent, in order to effectuate what the principal wants. And you can test whether or not it does by looking at variation in the design of administrative agencies over time to see whether or not in instances where you have divided government, there's more attention to procedure and all these other institutional design features that would effectuate the will of the principal, Congress. Whereas, and so this is a pretty minor point. But I think that the principal agent work that's being done here is more a question of, is a shorthand for a political theory that we can use to understand what courts are doing, rather than necessarily an explanatory theory of why it is that electoral commissions then give rise to certain kinds of judicial politics. Okay, so I'm running short of time, so I'm going to move to the next paper. This is something I know much less about. So this is also an area of the world I know much less about. And my impression here is that this is a really important contribution to the literature, because very few people are willing to stake themselves to say that the military is a good thing. It's actually, and that the military should be included in the design of post-transition and democracies. It's not an easy, it's not an easy point to make oftentimes, even though, this is the world where we live in, right? This is the world we live in, and indeed the military can play a positive role, as you mentioned.
Militaries can play a positive
so my point is here, because
it's really
my sense is here
just
that
to
clarify
the
nature
is very much based on your two cases,
the argument
Portugal and Turkey.
When it comes to why it is that Portugal and Turkey were such were success cases. I mean, Turkey, as you say, it had problems, but in relative terms, it wasn't Chile, right? So why are they success cases? And so the first question I had is, and you to some extent answered this in your comments here, but why is it that the incentives, the sort of good militaries are different from bad militaries in the transition when their interests seem to be the same? I mean, you say that, well, the military has an interest in stability, political pluralism, unity, and in theory, these interests that are identifying the mechanism that gives rise to military support for democracy could actually apply to good and bad militaries. Now, you say that culturally speaking, a military full of citizen soldiers that's been part of NATO exercises and other kinds of international institutions, that's never been used for internal policing as opposed to external policing, is more likely to foster a democratic transition than a Praetorian military. But I thought you should explain that more carefully, because otherwise it really isn't clear why it's different in Chile as compared to Portugal or Turkey. And this might just be because I don't know enough about these areas of the world. But indeed, the cultural argument is somewhat at cross purposes with the more public choice argument that you make. So they have different kinds of theoretical presuppositions. So that's the first point. And the second point is, why would any dictator ever foster this kind of military that you're talking about? Because this is and here, I mean, this is a big question that requires huge amounts of historical analysis. But at many points, it raises the question: well, why would any dictator not use the military to internally suppress resistance? Why would this kind of positive citizen soldier, externally focused military ever emerge? Now, of course, on the citizen soldier front, there are resource constraints, of course. So you can imagine that certain countries have the resource constraints that give rise to this kind of army. But when it comes to internal use of the army internally, it seems there must be other explanations going on why it is that this option was not on the table for the pre-transition government. So I thought you could elaborate a little bit on that. And so, there you have it.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to actually thank Richard as well for inviting me. These were great papers. I enjoyed them, and I look forward to reading Nicholas's and Ozan's work as their careers progress. Now, what Richard asked me to do was to talk a bit about the commonalities of the two papers, but what Richard didn't ask me, what was understood as the very last speaker on a very long and rich day, my job is to be efficient so we can actually get out and enjoy dinner as soon as possible. But let me talk about, on one hand, they're really different papers, right? Nicholas talks about a consolidated democracy, right? He focuses on how we're really different from other countries and how that facilitates polarization, whereas Ozan's paper talks about new democracies, transitional democracies, and he makes a very provocative and very neat point that maybe sometimes under certain circumstances that I think are nicely defined in his paper, they may play a positive role in a new democracy. But here's what they have in common, which I think is important, which is they share a kind of a shared really big question that I really applaud, which is what is the relationship, right, between constitutional rules or constitutional politics and the health of a democracy, right? I think about, in fact, the field I spent a lot of time dealing with, which is constitutional theory here in the United States, where people have been engaged for a long time over various interpretive battles with absolutely no concern whatsoever for what the state of democracy is in the United States, right? Democracy now in the 21st century may well be, there are no really serious ideological opponents to it, but there are serious problems, right, with democratic deficits, and I think scholars really need to engage that. Just because the Supreme Court of the United States more or less wrote the preamble out of the Constitution doesn't mean as scholars we should follow suit. So let me get to the papers. Let me start with Nicholas. And actually, Nicholas, I wanted to thank Nicholas because every time that I teach the voting rights cases in my class, one of the things I tell the students is what a truly awful, abysmal system that we have, and that if anybody wanted to figure out how to help out sort of new democracies, don't do it like we do it here. And Nicholas' paper is just great at pointing out what the differences are and really illustrating what those problems are. That said, I've got really three questions, right? One focuses on the problem of constitutional change, the other on the problem of political polarization, and the last, I'm going to say, like, what's so great about the United States Senate? So here's the problem with change, right? So one of the things you talk about is how the other countries on the list made that move from having politicians redraw districts to having independent commissions do it. And you say it's likely that we'll do it again. I'm going to pick up some points that Francesca made because of agency cost. And I'm skeptical. I understand your point, which is it would be more efficient if we moved to that system, and there's all kinds of payoffs to it. But I guess, and perhaps this comes from having spent too much time in studying underdeveloped countries, but I think suboptimal institutional arrangements are actually incredibly sticky. That's what makes them really interesting. We have had gerrymandering since the early days of the Republic, and it's not clear to me that that's going to change anytime soon, especially since, if you think about how different we are from the other countries that are studied, we have a lot more veto points, right, than any of those countries do. And so maybe the design of the Constitution is working quite well by making it impossible to have any kind of a reform that prevents sort of the political players with intense preferences from making any kind of a change. So that's my first question. The other question is the relationship you draw between how districts are redrawn and political polarization, right? And I wonder if that works quite as well as you say, because here's what I think is really interesting about what's going on in the United States, is that the two main political parties have learned some lessons, which there's actually a payoff in terms of getting votes from being somewhat more pure ideologically. That was not true here in the past. Now, separation of powers works reasonably well when you have parties that have sort of different, left, right, the way we used to have that here, because that way bargaining was both woven into the text of the Constitution and it was woven into the fabric of the political parties. We don't have that anymore. Right? And so we are engaged on a really unique experiment, which is what happens when you have separation of powers in parliamentary parties. Right? And so I think polarization is going to be with us for quite some time, regardless of how we go about drawing districts. And the last question is what's so great about the United States Senate? Because one of the things you praise, right, in other countries is that they allow a greater degree of malapportionment than we do, that they respect neighborhoods and communities. Well, we do that, right, with the Senate. I mean, that's what states are. And what's the payoff to malapportionment, right? I mean, why should we, it's bad enough that we have a system in this country that makes it very difficult for the political system to reflect the views of the median voter. Why should we encourage any sorts of changes that will simply worsen or exacerbate that problem is really my question. And to Ozan, I'm going to actually have a thanks as well, which is that you probably could not have found a reader who was more sort of disposed to kind of disagree with your basic point. Well, no, I'm serious. Both as a student of Latin American politics and, frankly, as a former citizen of Argentina, I have no sympathy for the military and politics whatsoever. You convinced me. It was a nice paper. Okay, I think that under the circumstances that you pointed out, the military can indeed play a positive role in a new democracy. That said, I've got two sort of big questions. The first is, maybe the cure is worse than the disease. And this is what I mean. So that I take it that for a country to become a consolidated democracy, right, one of the keys is there has to be some political learning in the key players. They have to learn. This takes a long time. They have to learn how to bargain, they have to learn how to compromise, and they have to do that within a set of rules that are constantly being renegotiated, right, all the time. And that sort of the political learning is impossible if the losing side can turn to the military and change the outcomes, right? I mean, I think that is the most robust explanation for why democracy broke down repeatedly in Latin America throughout the 20th century. And so I think that's going to be a problem. The countries that you suggest, once they've invited them, once the military is in, once it has certain prerogatives, it's not leaving, and it's going to make it very difficult for the leading political actors to learn the sort of mores, attitudes that you need to have democracy succeed over the long term. That's my first one. The next one picks up some of the points that Francesca was making about what about other countries? In particular, I would urge you to think a bit more about military politics, right? Because the thing that I find that's really intriguing, right, about the transitions that occurred in the 1980s is the military was involved in the large majority of them, and they sort of bargained their way out of power. And so, for example, the military that you criticized, the Praetorian military, that the great examples are not just Chile, but the entire southern continent, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, all of them are fine examples of that. Well, guess what? They're out of power. All of those countries have very robust democracies at this point, and so the question is, what's so great about the independent military if these countries are doing quite well? And I think the answer may simply be that the countries you're talking about have serious anti-democratic players other than the military, which was not true in the countries at stake. But nonetheless, I think you need to fine-tune that comparison that you're making between those two different kinds of those two different kinds of militaries a bit more. And in conclusion, I'm going to reach to something a little bit differently, which is that there's been a long-standing sort of distinction, obviously, between people who do private and public comparative law. If these two papers are an indication of the state of field, we may get quite a few more people doing comparative public law. And I hope we can have a conversation, right, with the two different branches, because I think they have a lot to say to each other. And that's why I really appreciate this conference for opening up that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much to the presenters for their wonderful comments. I don't have extensive comments in response, and we can also chat about this later, but a couple quick things. So in my invocation of principal agent theory and I guess the agency costs that I associate with the American districting system, I didn't mean to suggest that because those costs are currently high, that's going to result in a transition in America to a lower agency cost world. I think the existence of those high costs is a powerful argument for the American system being deficient, but of course the agents, who in my model are the politicians who now have the power to draw district lines, they have zero interest in giving up that authority. The agency costs are agency benefits to them. And so, in my mind, the whole game is figuring out how we can use all sorts of other mechanisms to reduce those agency costs, but it's certainly not going to happen just because of the very existence of those costs. Just quickly to respond to Miguel on polarization, I certainly don't think redistricting can solve the current state of polarization in America. I think there are deep-rooted historical explanations for why our parties have become so polarized today. My sense is that if you drew districts along the lines that I lay out, it could have some positive impact on the level of polarization. Would it return us to the days of LBJ or the 50s or 60s? Certainly not. But if it took 10%, 20% off the current level of polarization, I sort of think every little bit helps, and we might as well. Nothing else has worked to reduce ever-rising polarization, and there's at least some potential that if you make politicians more responsive to their constituents, they'll become less responsive to their parties, and that'll result in a more effective governmental system. On the Senate, I think I do. I would like to weaken the one-person, one-vote rule slightly. I would not want to weaken it to the point of being like the U.S. Senate. So, I'm okay with the differential of, let's say, 10%, 20% between district populations. I'm not okay with having California and Wyoming have the same representation. The point is more that when you have an extremely strict one-person, one-vote rule, as the U.S. does, all the other criteria you might want to use to redistrict go out the window. So I'm just saying relax the one-person, one-vote rule a bit to British levels or Canadian levels, and in the process allow us to pursue all the other valuable goals that we're giving short shrift to right now. So compactness, respect for political subdivisions, respect for communities of interest. Right now we sacrifice on all of those goals because we're so focused on having every district have exactly the right population, and that seems like a bit of a silly emphasis in our system.
Okay, thank you to you both for your comments. Let me start with Francesca's first comment, which was also Miguel's last comment. So the two interests of the good and the bad militaries may align, and I think that's right. I think the institutional interests that I talk about in the article, political pluralism, stability, and national unity, I think both good and bad militaries may have those same institutional self-interest. But the interdependent military, the good type of military, is less likely to abuse the powers that are given to them. So that's why I draw that distinction. I think bad militaries can certainly have those same institutional self-interests as well, but if they do take power, then they may never leave, which I think also distinguishes some of the examples that Miguel mentioned in Latin America, particularly with Praetorian militaries. They might be doing, those countries might be doing fine now, but it took them a very long time to get there, and they were under prolonged military rule, which, for example, Portugal and Turkey were not. Francesca's second question, which is a really good one, is why would a dictatorship ever create this type of military when it can then be used against it? You answered part of the question, which is the citizen-soldier point. It's just the resource constraint. So they don't. The government doesn't want to pay to have a military, so they just mandate conscription, and that also actually serves as a restraint on the government's ability to use the military to police the population. So if you've got citizen soldiers on the ground, and if you give them orders to shoot on the population, well, they will refuse, as they did in the case of Turkey in 1960, and so that poses some impediments on the dictatorship's ability to tweak it tweak the military to their liking. Miguel's second point about the cure is better than the disease, and I think in certain contexts, certainly that might be the case. The cost of getting the military involved might be higher than the benefits, but I do think we can learn from these two case studies that I have in the article to make sure that the cure is best suited for what the military can do. So if you look at Turkey and Portugal, the main difference that comes out of the two countries is that Portugal, the Portuguese military, created strong political parties at the end of the transition period. And those parties, 6 years after the transition, could then attack the military from a position of strength. I think had they tried to kick the military out right after the coup, the military would have dug in rather than given to their request. Whereas in the Turkish case, the Turkish constitution of 1961 significantly weakened the elected branches and the political parties, and the modernization happened too quickly without effective political institutionalization. And that weak political government can then never get the military out of politics until recently, of course. I think beginning in 1999, especially in 2002, when the current government came into power in Turkey, Justice and Development Party, with a strong mandate from the government, then they were able to reduce the military's prerogatives in Turkey. And so creating strong political institutions is very important in that regard. And then I'll also mention one final point about Miguel's initial opening remarks about the state of democracy in the United States. I think the point is sometimes lost on us that it took us a very long time to get here. In this era of Twitter revolutions, I think we just sort of expected constitutional democracy to come about right away, for these countries to form political parties right away, to join our democratic alliances, get the military out of politics, and they just can't cope. And if you look at the beginning of the United States, in U.S. history, the military did play some role. George Washington was a military general. John Marshall has served as Washington's lieutenant in the military as well, and that actually produced some sense of national unity in the United States. Chief Justice Marshall famously came to think of himself as a citizen of the United States and not of Virginia, following his service in the military. And so I think we do need to keep in mind that these are new democracies. There are going to be democratic deficits no matter what we do, and I think we'd be best served by trying to come up with ways that they can become democracies despite the deficits, the democratic deficits that are bound to exist in the transition process.
Thank you. I'm told I have 15 minutes to invite questions, so I'll invite you to come to the microphones and give your comments to Ozan and Nick. And before you do, I just want to thank again Francesca and Miguel for their contributions to the panel and to the development of Nick and Ozan's respective papers.
Gary Bell from Singapore. I have a comment for Nicholas, but before I do, I'm going back to Singapore on Monday, and I hope to still have a job when I get there. So could I be off the record on this comment? I don't normally comment on Singapore politics for obvious reasons. So obvious reason, not being a Singaporean, it's not really for me to comment. But I would like to comment on what you said about Singapore in terms of positive comment you made, thank you, that in fact there was representation of minorities, because in Singapore indeed more than 90% of the member of parliaments are elected in multi-member districts, and indeed by law each party must have one minority running on their list in each of these districts. But if you look at it more deeply and in context, the minorities will be quite skeptical about this and would be actually I'll explain why. First of all, the real reason was not a concern for the minorities, many would say. The real reason was that there were parties that were representing the minorities. There was a Malay party in Singapore. Malays make about 15%. That new rule makes it impossible for a Malay party to run in Singapore, because they would have to have a majority of their list to be from Chinese. So therefore, many people believe that's a real goal behind the rule. The second thing, why the minoritarians are not very happy with this, they don't get to elect their representative. Effectively, the representatives are elected on a list, and the minorities are a minority in every district, and therefore it is the Chinese majority that votes with the list and therefore there's a problem of legitimacy. Another thing that Singapore government did is that they moved the population in public housing, which is where 87% of people live. They have rules that Malays or Indians cannot form more than, respectively, I think 18 and 8% in each block of apartment. So they cannot have a place of their own where they could have, because we do have some single member constituencies, but there's no place where they could possibly elect their own representative. So the minorities are not very happy about this. And also, last thing, our electoral campaigns are very short, 7 days. In many ways, it's a blessing. In many ways, it's a blessing. But the president, on the advice of the government, will not only is the rule that you have to have a minority on every list, but the president will say a few days before nomination days of which race that minority must be in each constituency. Which, for example, if an opposition party has had an Indian candidate in their mind working in a certain constituency, the government could, I don't say they would, but they could say, okay, in that constituency will be a Malay, therefore completely making it difficult for the opposition to win. I'm glad to report in the last election the opposition for the first time won a group constituency, right, for the first time. But you can see that there are lots of reasons why that was the first time, right? It has never happened since 1965. So you have to look at the context. It looks good, minorities are numerous in parliament, but minorities are not happy about it.
We'll just wait. Lisa?
Just a brief question for Nick that really is just underscoring something that I think was very important that Francesca said. You know, this idea that the United States is marked, in your particular case, of electoral redistricting by a high degree of politicization alongside a high degree of judicialization really characterizes basic political and legal culture. And Francesca didn't specifically mention this, but I mean, I started thinking of Kagan's adversarial legalism, and this is basically the argument that where you have deep structural features like fragmented political authority and continuing distrust of centralized bureaucracy, and at the same time a strong rights culture and a continuing sense of entitlement for social programs, that is going to lead to overlapping processes of politicization and judicialization that are going to continuously reinforce the other. And so in one sense, your story is very satisfying and elegant because it fits within this very deep insight about the nature of American law and political culture. But I think, and this was, I think, the point that Francesca was putting some pressure on you, was it makes it harder to identify particular ways in which you can tweak the problem that you're looking at, given that they're so well reinforced by deeper structural features.
Nicholas, do you want to take a minute to respond, and then we'll get through more questions?
Sure. So on Singapore, you know, it's not my favorite model for minority representation, and it's also a case that I consider to be not at all independent redistricting. I mean, as the question pointed out, there's all sorts of manipulation of the electoral system by the government. So, you know, Singapore is an interesting case, but it's certainly not the model that I'd want other regimes to follow. I think Nathan's point is taken very well, that, you know, the U.S. is a high politicization, high judicialization regime everywhere, not just in redistricting. What I think gives me hope in redistricting is that we're starting to see exceptions to this pattern even within the U.S. We don't only have to look abroad to find exceptions. So we do have a growing number of states that have transferred the power to draw district lines away from political actors to commissions. And then in those same states, there's now a pretty good record of very high judicial deference to the decisions of the commissions. So the U.S. as a whole remains very much stuck in the high politicization, high judicialization quadrant, but a number of states are escaping from that quadrant and moving toward the model of the rest of the world. So, you know, maybe other parts of our country are more stuck in high politicization, high judicialization, but I think in this arena we're seeing progress, and so I think it is worthwhile to encourage further progress. Iowa's a fantastic model, yep, for a long time.
Yeah, I actually moved ahead on the line because I have a question for Ozan, but I wanted to say that actually Nason asked my question of Nick, and just to tweak that slightly, I wonder whether if you can sort of array societies from technocratic to, combative in the way that facts are determined. How much does expertise in general matter? I think that also may explain some of your cultural variation. But I had a question for Ozan. So first of all, I think, actually in both cases, these are great topics for comparative research, and I think they're great papers. And I think the militaries are one of the great underexplored topics in comparative constitutional law. And so my question is to ask a little bit more about what is it about militaries that are doing the work, right? Because you sort of take a military as a self-evident category, and I know you know it's not actually. So under the surface, do militaries have sort of moderating or institution building or good constitutional effects if they have a good legal structure inside, right? Like if they're actually trained at the Geneva Conventions, or, I was thinking, you mentioned NATO late in the talk about Turkey, but, one of the things that comes with is training to a certain set of legal standards, which might make them think that law matters more when, in other contexts as well. Or is it, to recycle a question from our last panel, networks? The fact that all the militaries in Latin America kind of do similar things at once may mean they're talking to each other and reinforcing each other, and that, depending on, what they're like, may be a good thing or a bad thing. So I'm wondering, is it, you could get more legalistic militaries, you could get more networked militaries, you could get the fact that they just have all the guns and so they kind of get used to pushing people around kind of militaries. So I'm wondering what it is about militaries that you think makes the difference across the range of your cases.
I also have a question for Ozan Varol. I liked in your response when you brought up the United States as an example of a constitutional democracy that was created by the military, which it was, in this case, the Continental Army. The federal constitution was, to a large extent, the creation of Army veterans. Their general was the first president. His lieutenant, as you said, in the Army was also his lieutenant in government. But they had a self-conception as public servants. They called themselves Cincinnati, citizen soldiers, as you said. And this culture is what mattered. The military was committed to constitutionalism and opposition to Caesarism, and they saw the protection of the rule of law as being one of their main functions. So I wonder, and I think that's what was decisive. That culture is what was decisive. So the question is, how do you foster a culture like that? How do you create a military that will see itself in that way? And this may be particularly important in moments of transition.
Sure. Yeah, let me actually start with answering that question. And the culture is very important. And I'll give an example from the Turkish military. The Turkish military in the 1960s was much more egalitarian than the rest of society. Citizen soldiers, it was the one place you can go, and this is probably true in a lot of post-authoritarian societies where the military espouses a citizen soldier model. The military is much more of an egalitarian institution than the other sort of authoritarian state institutions that are usually marked by nepotism and cronyism and corruption and all of that. It's the one place where you can go where you could advance based on merits and not on accidents of birth. And so I think that led the population to view the military as a just and legitimate organization, and also then to turn to the society and demand the same sort of justice from them. And so even as someone from a humble background, you can go into the Turkish military in advance. And I think that did play an important role in when the military stepped in to serve as this agent of modernization. That culture you mentioned, to a large extent that was present in Turkey, and I think in Portugal as well. And that actually relates to Kim's question to some extent. I think, so the egalitarian culture of the military certainly plays a role. It's not all that easy to figure out what's going under the surface in a military organization because they're just so opaque. But you mentioned one of the common threads that I could identify, which is the influence of international organizations. I don't know that actually affects the legal structure of the military, but it certainly affects the culture because they do go abroad. In the 1960s, Turkish officers went abroad and were influenced by the democracies in existence there. But I think it's an important question, and I'll have to do more thinking and research on it.
A few points for Nick, and I'd like you to at least respond to them or consider them. First of all, I think the emphasis on whether politicians draw the boundaries underplays seriously control by politicians in setting the criteria. Let me give you an example from Australia. The conservative side of politics in Australia for a long time, they didn't draw the individual boundaries. The gerrymander was in the criteria. And eventually that was done away with, but it took a long time. There are other countries where the politicians have control or jockeying control over allocation between regions and single district, multi-member. Japan would certainly be an example of that. Second point, in a country that is not ethnically divided very much, in other words, not the United States, but again, a country like Australia, what are the main political divisions? They're rural versus urban, so of course that's geographic, and more affluent, less affluent, and in a large city, that's geographic. And so what you get is a large number of non-competitive districts that way. Yes, the member is responsive to that district very much. I mean, rural, urban, affluent, non-affluent, but it has a lot of disadvantages too. I think, third point, I think you didn't talk about this very much, but the comments seem to bring it out. It seems that you're advocating to counteract that, basically multi-member districts elected proportionally, but apart from the disadvantage of having districts that are much larger, much greater population, you actually get, I think, more partisanship because the members are dependent on their parties to get the 1/4 of the votes or whatever it is needed to be elected. Whereas I think the single member representation might be more responsive to the district as a whole.
Nick, you take that question?
Yeah, sure. So lots of good points there. So I think it's right that in Australia and in Canada and in France and Japan, a lot of the malapportionment we saw historically was not because of the politicians drawing the lines. It was because they would have rules that, like, the rural areas must have 50 seats and the cities must have 20 seats. Given those constraints, commissions go have fun and draw whatever districts you want. Obviously, if those are the parameters you give the commissions, you're going to get some pretty unfair districts. In all of those countries, that was the style of politician-chosen criteria that were problematic. And the one-person, one-vote rule, even a relaxed one-person, one-vote rule, pretty much addresses all of those sorts of perversions by the politicians of the criteria themselves. In terms of districts being non-competitive if they're drawn pursuant to the conventional criteria, it's a logical argument, but the empirical evidence is quite weak on this. So there's a pretty large political science literature on what's the relationship between district homogeneity or heterogeneity in terms of socioeconomic factors and how competitive is that district. And the main conclusion is there's either no link or a very weak link, but there's certainly no systematic relationship that says that more homogeneous socioeconomic districts are also less competitive. The link isn't there in the evidence. And also in a world of multi-member districts, which is the ideal world that I would envision, there it wouldn't matter so much if the overall district composition was 50-50, because even if it wasn't 50-50, smaller political groups would be able to win seats within that district. On your final point, I think that large multi-member districts would promote partisanship only if they used some variant of list proportional representation. That's not the kind of large district, and it's not the kind of voting rule I have in mind. So I'm supportive of much smaller multi-member districts, 3, 4, 5-member districts with rules like limited voting, cumulative voting, preferential voting. In those sorts of systems, they're still very candidate-centric, not party-centric. Especially all of these systems, you have to vote for the candidate. You don't vote for the party. So I think they're all quite similar to the American status quo and wouldn't promote the kind of party-centric politics you see in pure PR systems.
The first bus, I understand, is leaving at 5:30, and I'm told I have to cut this off. So I'll invite Paul and Richard to please give your comments individually to Nick and Ozan. So let's thank Nick and Ozan and Francesca and Miguel. Thank you. Thank you. Continue the conversation.